Okay, welcome back to Sermon Rewind. Things may look a little different than what you've seen in previous episodes. We normally would have a co-host. It very well may be the case that for at least the time being, you're just gonna have to stare at me, so I apologize in advance. That being said, Sermon Rewind, if you're not familiar, is a short but hopefully helpful show that looks backwards at the sermon from the previous Sunday and tries to unpack both some questions that the viewers give us, as well as kind of some of the practical rolling out of what it looks like in real life and real time to live this out. And so with that in mind, if you haven't been following along, we have been in a long series in the book of Acts for quite some time now. And we found ourselves closing out chapter 13 this past week with verses 39 through 52. And in chapter 13, as I said on Sunday, this is kind of the beginning or the inaugural push, so to speak, of Paul and his constituencies, missionary journeys into what would be northwestern Europe. And during this time, Paul is kind of getting his feet wet in ministry. He's trying to figure out what it looks like to preach to Gentiles and Jews alike, how they're going to receive it, how they're going to respond to it. And as I said with our big idea this past Sunday, he comes to find out that living on mission, which is not only for him, but for us as well, that it comes with a mixed bag of challenges and rewards. And so what I hoped to do this past Sunday was take three, what I refer to as missionary truths from out of this long text that we might learn from the experiences of other missionaries in the past as we continue on in mission ahead. And so here's what those were. As a means of encouragement, we come to find in verses 42 through 52 that most people, Jew and Gentile alike, are genuinely curious about what it is we believe, things about Jesus, and the way that he has radically transformed our life. However, genuinely curious does not mean that they are going to be receptive of it, meaning they're not necessarily all going to automatically become avid followers of Jesus any more than they are going to be interested in hearing more about your life story. However, the good news is, receptive to it or not, whenever the gospel is preached by God's people, Jesus promises to accomplish good work through it. So that just encourages us to remember that no matter who we preach to, how we preach, or how often, that Jesus is always going to bring some semblance of fruit out of that labor. So now with that in mind, we typically like to dive into questions that the viewers give to us. We only have one this week, but I think it's a really good one, and I think it applies to a lot of us. So here's how it goes. The question was, after Paul and his crew was ultimately turned aside with his message, he left Antioch and went on. He went on to other cities, went on to other people. So the question is, if we share the gospel with friends and are rejected, we don't get to leave like Paul and Barnabas and others leave. So how do we move forward in a situation like that? Do we continue to pressure them at every opportunity they have? Or are we able to just sort of move on and accept the fact that we've done the very best we can do? It's a great question because I think we all come to this impasse at times in our lives, right? We have good friends or family members that we know and feel pressed upon by the Spirit to preach good news, to share the good news of Jesus with them. But like most people, they're not all that receptive. So what do we do with that? We just can't leave, can't just cut out of our family, though some of you may want to. We have to stick it out with them. So what does it look like for us to move on? I think the best way to go about this is to understand that you can leave the conversation behind. Not permanently, meaning if somebody is frustrated and unwilling and hard-hearted and stiff-necked towards any of your attempts in the gospel message, and it is just getting to a point where the relationship is growing stale and maybe they're getting bitter toward you, yes, you can hit pause and remove that as a topic of conversation when you don't see any fruit being borne through it. What you cannot do is leave it forever. So let's say fast forward 2 years, that same person comes back to you and says, hey, you know how you used to pray for me, or you know how you used to encourage me to trust Jesus? You know, I've been going through some stuff in my life, and I know it was really hard back then, but I'm thinking maybe there's more truth to it. Would you be willing to tell me more about this? We can't say, nope, sorry, you had your chance. We're not doing it anymore. We have to always be willing to give an account for the hope that we have whenever the Lord opens opportunities for that to happen. However, Jesus himself tells us that we should not throw pearls before swine. Now, that doesn't mean that people who are not necessarily quick to receive what we have to say are swine. It's not necessarily a negative connotation. He's simply saying, in the same way you wouldn't pour a bag of diamonds into a feeding trough for livestock because they cannot value what's in front of them, you don't have to continuously offer the most glorious and beautiful gospel to people who, for whatever reason, at that point in their journey, would just as much gobble it up or trample them under feet. There is a sense in which you are free to navigate in that relationship as faithfully as possible, but to know that there very well may be a limit. So you can leave the conversation behind temporarily if need be. Now, one thing that I would just like to throw out there as a point of application. When it comes to preaching on Sundays, I fully recognize that no matter how sharp I think I am, 30 minutes is a lot of time for people to sit and listen, and chances are you maybe walked away with a little bit. And so I always like to think through if there was one thing, one point of encouragement, one point of application that I could pass on to the listener, it would be this. I said it before on Sunday, and I've said it a lot during Acts, and I'll probably say it many more times, is that Acts is not just a history lesson. It's not just a history book. It is encouragement from past missionaries who are passing on good news to future missionaries so that they might run the race in faith as well. And so when you read these stories, as often as you want to look for ways in which there's objections, look for far more ways to be encouraged to follow suit. These men, by God's grace, went all over the world, and they took advantage of every opportunity they could to preach Jesus, even if it meant there were a lot of objections, maybe even persecution to follow. Follow suit. The leaders that have gone before you that have paved the way, follow suit. Do not be ashamed. Do not be afraid. Do not be embarrassed. Do not be concerned with what happens, whether or not someone will receive it or not, because as we heard on Sunday, Jesus will bear fruit when the gospel is preached. Now, I'll just say this one final thing. At the beginning of the sermon and the end, I said two things, that most people are genuinely curious, and that whether or not they receive it is a bit of a moot point because Jesus will always bear fruit through it. So if those two obstacles are taken off your plate, the question you need to ask yourself this week is, what other excuses do I have before me or in me that keep me from sharing good news with the people that are in my life? Now, you obviously don't need to chime in and tell me what those are, but it would be good for you to literally take out a pen and a piece of paper and begin to make note. What are the fears? What are the apprehensions? What are the concerns? What are the things that cause me trepidation when it comes to preaching good news? If these two things are off the table, then what else stands? And then begin to make a list of those things. And in your prayers before Jesus this week, simply do this. Ask Jesus that he would speak to you about them through his word. Ask Jesus that he would convince you that the Holy Spirit is capable, able, and present to walk you through those. And then ask Jesus that he would reveal to you his might, his power, and his desire to perform miraculously through his gospel, no matter what is in front of him. That is the only way that any of us move forward on mission, and I pray that you are encouraged this week as you give this some thought. Friends, as always, we love you. We look forward to seeing you this next week.